Locked in a storage drawer inside a Nevada museum, a mummified man sat forgotten for 54 years, waiting to blow apart one of American archaeology's oldest assumptions and ignite a 20-year legal war over exactly who he was. Everyone who ever looked at him assumed the same thing: an ordinary, fairly recent burial, nothing worth a second glance. That assumption was wrong. He turned out to be one of the oldest mummified human beings ever found in North America, and for 2 decades, the United States government refused to say for certain he was Native American at all. The agency holding that power was the Bureau of Land Management, and its own federal reviewers accused it of ignoring the evidence sitting right in front of it. One scientist, a Danish geneticist named Eske Willerslev, had already fought this exact battle once before on a nearly identical set of bones, and it cost him years just to earn enough trust to be allowed to touch this one. It started in August of 1940 in a dry rock shelter east of Fallon, Nevada. Not a well, whatever the title told you, when 2 archaeologists pulled a body wrapped in woven reeds out of the desert floor, moccasins still laced on its feet. The rock shelter sits near Grimes Point in the shadow of the Stillwater Mountains, more than 4,000 feet above the desert floor. Sydney and Georgia Wheeler, the husband and wife team who found him, worked for the Nevada State Parks Commission, and they were racing against a different kind of threat. Companies were mining the desert caves for bat guano, digging out centuries of bird and bat droppings to sell as fertilizer, burying archaeological evidence in the process, cave by cave. The Wheelers weren't hunting for a mummy. They were trying to document what was about to be erased. What they found inside Spirit Cave stopped them cold. 2 burials, wrapped in woven tule matting, tucked into the dry floor of the shelter, undisturbed for thousands of years. The deeper of the 2 had partially mummified in the arid desert air, the same conditions that had preserved grain and baskets in caves across the Great Basin for millennia. Skin still clung to the shoulders and back. A tuft of dark hair remained on the skull. He lay curled on his right side, one hand tucked beneath his chin, wrapped in a rabbit fur blanket and a diamond-plated reed mat, the kind of careful burial that told the Wheelers this was no accident, no casual disposal. Someone had loved this man enough to prepare him for the ground with real care. On his feet were leather moccasins made from marmot hide, one patched with antelope skin, stuffed with tule reeds as socks against the desert cold. 67 artifacts came out of that cave with him: woven bags, tools, and the cremated remains of at least 2 other individuals, bundled separately nearby. Later study would reveal a healed skull fracture, 3 badly abscessed teeth that likely caused his death, and an unusual extra vertebra in his spine. Even his last meals survived, preserved in fossilized waste from the cave floor, fish, and bulrush seeds from a much wetter Nevada. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary find, the kind of discovery that should have made headlines for decades. Instead, it was packed into crates, shipped to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City, and left alone. The Wheelers guessed his age the only way anyone could in 1940. They looked at the weaving style, the tools, and compared them to other regional sites, already loosely dated by similar methods. Their estimate landed around 1,500 to 2,000 years old enough to matter, recent enough to fit comfortably inside what everyone already believed about the Great Basin. Nobody radiocarbon dated him. Nobody needed to, or so it seemed. The story made sense, so the story stood, filed away for 54 years while the body itself sat on a shelf a few rooms away, unstudied, essentially invisible. An estimate born from a glance at some reed weaving became the accepted history of a human being for over half a century. Nobody checked it because nobody had a reason to doubt it, until, in 1994, someone finally did, almost by accident. It helps to remember what archaeology looked like in 1940. There was no strict chain of custody, no formal excavation permit process, the way there is today. The Wheelers kept field notes, But by later standards, those notes were thin, more concerned with rescuing what they could from the guano miners than documenting it to modern forensic precision. That gap wouldn't matter for decades. Later, when lawyers and federal reviewers went looking for firm answers about exactly how he'd been buried, that same thin documentation would become part of the argument, a detail nobody in 1940 could have known would end up in a courtroom. To understand why that check mattered, you need to understand what science believed about the first Americans through most of the 20th century. The dominant theory said that around 13,000 years ago, small bands of hunters crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, moved south through an ice-free corridor, and became the direct ancestors of every indigenous population from the Arctic to the tip of South America. Archaeologists called this the Clovis First Model, named for stone spear points, first identified near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. It had been the working answer for decades, and sites that hinted at something older tended to get dismissed or quietly set aside, because an older date meant rewriting a model the entire field had built careers on. A body from a cave near Fallon, filed away at 2,000 years old, fit that picture without friction. Nothing about him seemed dangerous to the existing timeline. That, it turns out, was exactly the problem, because in 1994, the Nevada State Museum agreed to let a newer kind of radiocarbon dating be tested on some of its older collections. The old bulk carbon method destroyed a relatively large sample to measure the average decay of billions of carbon atoms at once. The new method, accelerator mass spectrometry, could count individual carbon isotopes directly on a sample small enough to barely be missed. The scientist running the tests was Irvin Taylor, a radiocarbon specialist at the University of California, Riverside. 17 samples went into his lab: hair, bone, textile, wood from the site, routine calibration work in theory, in a working accelerator facility, gloved technicians moving fragments of ancient bone under bright lab lights, a screen somewhere about to render a number nobody in that building expected to see. Then the numbers came back. The Spirit Cave remains weren't 1,500 years old. They weren't even 2,000. The signature pointed to roughly 9,400 radiocarbon years, calibrating out to around 10,600 calendar years before present. Taylor's team didn't believe it the first time. They ran the samples again, checking for contamination, checking the machine. The number held. Amy Dancy, the Nevada State Museum anthropologist overseeing the collection, later said the result was nothing short of astonishing. A man filed away as a recent burial for 54 years turned out to be one of the oldest naturally mummified human beings ever found in North America. Older than the pyramids by thousands of years. That should have been the entire story. A record-breaking discovery, hiding in a museum drawer the whole time. But the age wasn't what turned Spirit Cave into a 20-year fight. What came next was, in 1997, two physical anthropologists, Richard Jantz at the University of Tennessee and Douglas Owsley at the Smithsonian, examined the skull using craniometric analysis. The method is simple on paper. Take dozens of precise skull measurements, feed them into a statistical model built from population databases worldwide, and see which modern groups the shape most closely resembles. It sounds like math, not opinion. When Jantz and Owsley ran the numbers on Spirit Cave, the result did not point toward the Native American populations living in the Great Basin today. It pointed somewhere else entirely, statistically closer to the Ainu of Japan or to certain European ranges than to any documented indigenous American group. Suddenly, a 10,000-year-old man from a Nevada cave wasn't just old. He was, according to one respected branch of anthropology, the wrong shape to belong to the people fighting to claim him. That claim didn't land in a vacuum either. A handful of very old, oddly measured American skeletons had already fed a broader theory circulating well beyond peer-reviewed journals, that some non-Asian population might have reached the Americas before the ancestors of today's indigenous nations. None of that was proven by Spirit Cave's skull, but the cultural appetite for a secret, forgotten other people was already primed, and it's part of why one craniometric study out of Tennessee traveled so far, carrying more weight than the underlying statistics really supported. This is where the story stops being about a mummy and starts being about a legal war. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, requires federal agencies to return Native American remains to culturally affiliated tribes. Spirit Cave sat on land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which meant the federal government, not the museum, held final say over what happened to him next. In March of 1997, the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe filed a formal claim. They already had a name for him, one that had nothing to do with radiocarbon dates or skull measurements. They called him the Storyteller. For 3 years, the case moved through bureaucratic review. In July of 2000, the Bureau of Land Management issued its determination. The remains could not reasonably be culturally affiliated with any modern tribe. Native American, yes, in the broadest sense. Affiliated with the Northern Paiute specifically, no. The door to repatriation stayed shut. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The Federal NAGPRA Review Committee, the independent body created to oversee cases exactly like this one, voted 6-1 that the agency had failed to fairly weigh the evidence in front of it. 6 votes to 1. That's a formal, documented rebuke from the government's own oversight panel. The tribe appealed to the Secretary of the Interior. They appealed to the BLM director. Both appeals failed. The determination stood, despite the warning from the committee built to catch exactly this kind of mistake. Ask who actually benefited from that outcome, not the tribe still waiting, generation after generation, for their ancestor to come home. But for a small number of researchers, an unaffiliated status meant the remains stayed legally available for continued study instead of being returned to the earth. That doesn't make anyone a villain. It makes this a system with competing incentives, one where a single bone measurement was quietly doing enormous legal work behind the scenes, keeping a body in limbo year after year while both sides insisted they were only following the evidence. There's a harder question sitting underneath all of it. Should a federal agency be allowed to decide something as personal as ancestry using a statistical shape comparison built from measuring tape and calipers, when the community demanding answers already has an oral tradition naming exactly who their ancestors are? Science treated the skull measurement as the objective input and the tribe's own testimony as the subjective one. That hierarchy is exactly what a federal judge would later say the BLM applied without enough justification. By 2004, the tribe had exhausted its administrative options, so they sued the Bureau of Land Management in federal court. In September of 2006, the United States District Court for the District of Nevada delivered a rare, pointed ruling. The BLM's decision had been arbitrary and capricious, not simply debatable. The agency had dismissed key evidence without properly explaining its reasoning. The case was sent back with instructions to actually weigh everything on the table. A man had now been dead for over 10,000 years, and in the eyes of the federal government, he still didn't have a legal identity. What finally broke the deadlock wasn't another skull study. It was DNA, and the man who brought it into the case had already fought almost this exact battle once before, on the same kind of measurement, a few hundred miles to the north. Eske Willerslev works out of the University of Copenhagen and the University of Cambridge. In 1996, 2 college students wading in the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, found another set of ancient remains, roughly 8,500 to 9,000 years old. Owsley, the same Smithsonian anthropologist who studied Spirit Cave's skull, argued that Kennewick man's cranium also looked non-native, closer to Polynesian or European ranges. Scientists sued the federal government for the right to study the bones in a case known as Bonnickson versus United States, and won. For nearly 2 decades, Kennewick man became the public face of an ancient outsider theory, a pre-native population that some believed had reached the Americas first, only to be replaced by later arrivals from Asia. Then in 2015, Willerslev's team sequenced Kennewick man's genome and published the results in Nature. The DNA told a completely different story than the skull ever had. Kennewick man was genetically closest to living Native American populations, more closely related to them than to any other group on Earth. The skull had been quietly misleading science for 2 decades. The genome ended the argument in a single study. Kennewick man was repatriated to 5 Columbia Plateau tribes and reburied in February of 2017. That precedent mattered for Spirit Cave, and not only scientifically. Willerslev didn't force his way into the Fallon Paiute Shoshone community, waving a court order. He asked. He was refused more than once, and each refusal was respected. He kept coming back to Fallon, meeting with tribal representatives, explaining what genome sequencing could and couldn't tell them, agreeing up front that a Native American result would trigger immediate repatriation, no further delay. Trust, not a subpoena, opened the door that a federal court order alone hadn't managed to open. In October of 2015, the tribe allowed his team to take samples. They went for the pitris bone, a small, extremely dense structure buried deep inside the skull near the ear, one of the hardest bones in the human body. That density makes it remarkably good at one specific thing, locking ancient DNA away, sealed off from 10,000 years of decay, bacteria, and desert heat that destroyed genetic material almost everywhere else in a skeleton. Researchers drilled a tiny sample from that bone and from one tooth and sent the material off for genomic sequencing. The wait stretched on for years because ancient DNA work is slow and dangerously easy to contaminate, and the results had to be checked and rechecked before anyone could publish with confidence or tell a grieving tribe the answer they'd waited 2 decades to hear. Then, on November 8, 2018, the results appeared in the journal Science, in a study led by J. Victor Moreno-Mayer and Eske Willerslev, alongside David Meltzer of Southern Methodist University, comparing 15 ancient genomes from Alaska to Patagonia. Spirit Cave's genome placed him firmly inside what researchers call the Southern Native American lineage, most closely related to a roughly 12,600-year-old infant known as the Anzac child, found in Montana. His Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA both matched lineages still carried by living Native American populations today, in unbroken continuity stretching across 10,000 years. There was no trace of the separate, non-native ancestry the skull had once seemed to suggest. Willerslev didn't mince words about what that meant. Spirit Cave and a similarly disputed skeleton from Lagoa Santa, Brazil, had both been treated as key evidence for a controversial Paleo-American population based entirely on skull shape. The genome proved otherwise, tying both individuals genetically to the direct ancestors of living indigenous populations. Meltzer, describing the same dataset, pointed to the striking speed implied by these genetic connections, noting the earliest peoples moved across an unfamiliar continent far faster than almost anyone had assumed. Sit with the size of that reversal. A statistical model built from skull measurements had shaped legal decisions and academic careers for 20 years, treated as functionally close to fact. The actual genetic code, sealed inside that same skull the entire time, said the opposite. The measurements weren't lying about the numbers. They were simply the wrong tool, applied with far too much confidence to a question only DNA could really answer. That doesn't mean craniometrics is worthless, or that Jantz and Owsley acted in bad faith. It means a method built on shape alone has limits nobody fully respected until a genome finally embarrassed it in public. Not everyone welcomed the resolution. Richard Jantz, one of the 2 researchers behind the original craniometric study, called it a sad day for science, warning that returning these remains meant losing irreplaceable data about the earliest human occupation of the Americas. He wasn't wrong that something real was lost. Once remains are reburied, they're gone from laboratories permanently. That tension between what science wants to keep studying and what a community has every right to reclaim didn't disappear just because one DNA test came back conclusive. The moment the genetic results reached the Bureau of Land Management, the 20-year standoff collapsed almost overnight. John Roos, the BLM's Nevada state director, acknowledged that while cultural affiliation with a specific tribe still couldn't be formally established through paperwork alone, the DNA evidence of Native American heritage made returning the remains to a tribe with deep ties to the land the clearly appropriate outcome. Control of the Spirit Cave remains transferred officially to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, effective November 18th of 2016, announced 5 days later. Interior Secretary Sally Jewell said at the time that she was pleased these remains were being returned to where they rightfully belonged. A short line for a fight this long, one that quietly ended a legal battle that had outlasted multiple federal administrations and one entire collapsing scientific paradigm. Think about what that transfer actually cost and who absorbed it. The museum lost a centerpiece specimen, a discovery that had briefly made Nevada relevant to a global conversation about the peopling of two continents. Researchers lost future access to tissue and genetic material that could have answered questions nobody has even thought to ask yet. The tribe, meanwhile, gained something that never shows up on an inventory sheet: an ancestor, back on land they never stopped considering theirs, buried according to their own customs instead of stored in a climate-controlled drawer. Both sides can be telling the truth about what they lost and gained. That's what makes this case messier and more honest than a simple story about villains and victims. The tribe waited nearly 2 more years before holding a reburial at a location that has never been made public in ground protected under federal cultural resource law. Willerslev attended at the tribe's invitation. In a statement released afterward, the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe put it plainly: the new genetic study confirmed what their oral tradition had always told them, that the man taken from Spirit Cave was their Native American ancestor. Willerslev later described the reburial as something close to laying a family member to rest, saying that for the tribe, it carried the same weight as burying a parent or a sibling. 78 years after Sidney and Georgia Wheeler pulled him from that cave floor, the storyteller went back into the earth on the tribe's own terms, under his own name, for the first time since 1940. But the story doesn't fully close there, and honestly, it shouldn't. Kennewick Man and Spirit Cave aren't isolated coincidences, sitting a few hundred miles apart. They're the same pattern, run twice, by the same scientist, on 2 sets of remains found several hundred miles apart. Both were labeled physically distinct from Native Americans based on skull shape alone. Both fed a public fascination with a mysterious other people. Both turned out, once the genetic code was read, to be directly ancestral to the very indigenous nations that had fought for their return. That's not one strange exception buried in the desert. That's a scientific method quietly failing the same way twice, in 2 cases public enough that we actually noticed, which raises an uncomfortable question about every other skeleton this method was ever used to classify, without a genome to check the answer. And the deeper questions haven't fully gone away either. In 2018, archaeologist Brian Hockett, who worked the case from the BLM side for years and watched the entire legal saga unfold from the inside, published research examining nearly 10,000 years of apparent genetic continuity, linking Spirit Cave to later populations in the region, including the Lovelock culture and the Northern Paiute themselves. That continuity complicates a separate, long-standing theory in Great Basin archaeology, one suggesting the ancestors of today's Paiute and Shoshone peoples arrived relatively recently, spreading rapidly across the region in what's called the Genomic spread, replacing whoever had lived there before them. If Hockett's reading holds up under further study, the roots in this patch of Nevada desert may run far deeper and far more continuously than that older model ever accounted for. The storyteller may not just be a distant relative of the Fallon Paiute Shoshone people. He may be far closer to a direct ancestor than the unaffiliated label ever allowed anyone to say out loud. So where does that leave the confident version of history everyone walked into this story believing? The 1940 estimate was wrong by a factor of 5. The 1997 skull analysis was wrong about who he was related to, wrong in a way that shaped federal policy for 2 decades. The United States government spent 20 years defending a legal position a judge eventually called arbitrary and capricious. And the version of the story that finally held up wasn't the one built on artifact style, and it wasn't the one built on statistical bone measurements. It was the one written directly into his cells, sequenced from a bone so dense it had outlasted everything else buried around it, sitting quietly inside his own skull the entire time anyone was arguing about who he was. Somewhere inside the Nevada State Museum today, there's a display case that used to hold the man the Wheelers found in that cave back in 1940. It doesn't anymore. What remains behind the glass is a replica pair of moccasins, a printed placard, and a description of a discovery whose meaning has shifted at least 3 separate times since that first radiocarbon test in 1994. Somewhere else, in university archives and genetic databases, his sequenced genome still exists, stripped of his name, reduced to data points that will keep being compared against every future ancient skeleton pulled out of a cave, a canyon, or a riverbank anywhere in the Americas. In that sense, he never fully left the laboratory. Part of him is still there, quietly rewriting the answer every time someone runs the comparison again. And somewhere out in the Stillwater Mountains, in ground the law will not let anyone identify or disturb, the storyteller rests in a grave that no museum catalog, no federal court filing, and no skull measurement will ever be allowed to reopen again.